I wanted to introduce, we have Anthony Gutierrez, who is joining us from Common Cause Texas. He is the executive director. And up first is Alexa Ura. She is the demographics reporter for the Texas Tribune. So knows Emma, but also knows Evan Smith was our keynote earlier. So I will let her kick it off. She's done some amazing reporting, and we can all learn from her.
Thank you. Hi, guys. I have just a couple of slides that I'm going to try to go through somewhat quickly in case I know you all want to have more discussion side of this. I am the demographics reporter for the Tribune, which means that I also cover voting rights, because in Texas, voting is in a lot of ways a demographic story. I have a couple of slides I want to go through so that you can sort of think about how to approach voting rights coverage. Some of it I think applies to other beats as well. But I want to start kind of broader in terms of the framing of voting coverage. I think in a lot of ways, it's pretty clear cut that as a reporter, you're writing on behalf of the public, right? You're holding government officials accountable on behalf of the public. The problem with things like voting is that they become so hyper politicized that there is a lot of pressure in terms of how things are being presented and how things are being reported on. And something that I like to keep in mind is that it's pretty clear cut that it's the same sort of approach, right? As a voting rights reporter, you are writing on behalf of the voter. And there's obviously a lot of noise around that in the legislative debate that can often come with voting. But I think it's an important thing to think about. And that doesn't have to look like opinions inserted into stories. That's not what we're here to do. But what it can look like is this example that I have up here is from a story we did last year when the legislature was debating our big voting bill. A version of that bill included a new formula to regulate polling places in only the big counties in Texas, which in Texas are all democratically controlled. And what we found when we basically took that formula, which was based on state house districts, and applied it, was that it would actually reduce polling places in areas that had a higher share of eligible voters of color. And so when you think about covering voting rights and thinking about covering them on behalf of the voters, this is what it can look like. It doesn't just have to be this is what Republicans say, this is what Democrats say. It can be, here's what this proposal is, and here's how it could actually affect voters in these communities. Another example is redistricting coverage. Obviously, a lot of this is sort of behind us in most states. I think there are a few stragglers out there. But as this sort of reaches the litigation part, there are things there's an approach to coverage that centers voters, even when you're doing things like redistricting coverage. In this case, this is a story from last fall where we were taking a proposal that ended up going through of a redrawn district in the north, in the DFW area. And basically what Republicans were doing, pretty surgically as you can tell, was dividing up these emerging voting blocks. And this is an example of Asian voters. This story has another example of Hispanic voters. But it's a lot of showing versus telling, right? And I think that, again, when you think about voting rights, yes, it's a political thing. Yes, there are political parties who are advancing things that they care about for specific reasons. But at the end of the day, the fallout is felt by real people and voters. And these are just some examples of how you can sort of really think about that framing and move away from the sort of both sides argument that when it comes to the actual process of voting doesn't really exist for an individual voter. The other thing I wanted to offer to you all is the importance of really telling it like it is. You know, obviously exact and clear language is really important for us as reporters. I think that's particularly important with voting rights coverage. You know, the first thing up here is sort of the relying on the experts say to kind of lay out the stakes of a proposal. I'll give you an example. In 2019, the state embarked on what it called a review of the voter rolls for supposed non-citizens. And what we found in that is that it was based on extremely flawed data. It was based on driver's license data. In Texas, if you are not a citizen, you can get a driver's license. You just have to tell them what your status is. And so what happened is they took this database and then compared it to the voter rolls and flagged all of these people who were supposedly non-US citizens. What they didn't account for was that people got a driver's license, became a US citizen, and then registered to vote. And so there were other news outlets that would point out this fact, but rely on experts saying that, when in reality, you can do the work as the reporter to be able to say that yourself. And I think that the honesty that comes with that is how you build credibility among voters, right? When you don't have to rely on other people, when you can do the work yourself to put the facts out there. I think in a lot of ways with the voting restriction debate, it's something similar. I think that sometimes there's so much pressure from the people pushing things that might restrict voting to not want to call them restrictions. And it's hard to break through that, right? There's a lot of pressure that comes from being the reporter that has to call something a restriction. And I think there's an importance to doing your homework, to knowing voting rules so that you can take a proposed legislative change and actually analyze it to determine, yes, this will restrict voting, and really be clear and say those things to readers. The last thing is obviously history matters. If you're in a state like Texas and probably some of the states that y'all are from, there are states with very, very dark and long histories of discrimination. And I think that things don't happen in a vacuum. And if you are covering something like voting, it is so important to not just study up on that history, but make sure it's included and reflected in your coverage. If you are writing about new congressional maps that weaken the influence of voters of color, it's important to point out that the state might have a history of doing that. So that is if you ever work with me, you'll hear this from me often, but these are sort of the things that I really, really push on people that I think in the end serve voters and build credibility among reporters with those voters. This is more practical advice. The idea of finding the worker bees. Here in Texas, elections are pretty decentralized. They're run by the counties. The Secretary of State is responsible for interpreting state law and telling counties how to enact it. And some of my best sources have really turned out to be these local election administrators and local election workers. There are people who I have built relationships with to where there are moments where you're reporting and you're thinking, I just really want to know if this thing exactly works the way I think it works. And there are people that you can call up or text and say, hey, do I have this correct? The importance of building that relationship with election administrators, I think it can be really, really beneficial. They often, depending on the setup of elections in your state, might get exclusive communications from the state in terms of how things are being implemented or timelines, so something to consider in your own communities. And there are often training or conferences for election workers that you can attend as press. There are election administration associations. I'm not sure what that might look like in all of your states, but they often have sort of yearly or semi-annual conferences in which they basically brush up on voting issues and how to enact voting changes. Sometimes the state presents at ours, and those can be really, really beneficial. One, to sort of hear what the conversations among people running elections can be like, but also so that you yourself can learn the process and so it can improve your reporting. And then obviously these folks are still part of the election ecosystem, and just because they might be great, reliable sources doesn't mean we don't hold them accountable. You all already know that. My other advice is the reminder to center your voters. I think voting coverage obviously largely comes out of state houses if you're doing that sort of reporting. But at the end of the day, you are talking about real people who, might be disenfranchised because of the actions that you are covering. So this is my plea to you all to remember to center your voters. The example at the top is from that 2019 effort to remove people from the voter rolls. We did sort of a flurry of coverage and thought it was important to actually go to people who were on this list. We were able to find people and talk to them and kind of profile what it felt like to them to have their citizenship questioned after they had gone through everything to get to that point and to vote. This example is actually more of a political example. This is from last summer when the Democrats broke quorum here to block the voting bill. And obviously there was a ton of coverage. It was sort of Texas pushed onto the national stage on the voting rights front. But in this story, it doesn't actually have voters, but what it does, it centers the struggle that was behind that walkout, because we had been covering the marathon legislative hearings where hundreds of people have turned out to testify against these measures, to talk about how they would affect voters of color, to talk about how they would affect voters with disabilities, and those comments were largely ignored. And so and part of the reasoning behind the walkout was that the legislation was being pushed without a whole lot of consideration for some of the things people were bringing up as potential issues. And so that is another example of how you can center your voters even if you are in the middle of breaking news and don't really have the time to go out and talk to a whole lot of individual people. The last example I'm actually going to show you on this side, because I think that what I've learned from covering voting is that people don't really accept other people's reality. If you are a voter with a car, with a schedule that allows you to go vote at any point in the early voting period if your state has one, if you are someone who really doesn't have to worry about being able to exercise this right, you might not accept other people's realities. And these are examples from a story we did in the summer of 2020. We had a runoff election. It was the first election in the pandemic here in Texas. It was pretty low turnout, but what we found, there were these instances of people, particularly voters with disabilities, for whom the system just didn't work when you put a pandemic over it. And there were obviously, at this time, there was a big debate over who could vote by mail, whether we extended early voting, what those hours look like. And so to us, it was important to find these individual people and really sort of highlight the issues that they were having. This was part of kind of like a bullet point series of paragraphs in the story to really highlight this. And then lastly, again, pretty practical, just public voter data. In most states, I believe it's going to be public data. You'll have to request it. In a state like Texas, it's a huge, huge file because we have millions of registered voters. Obviously, there can be some cost limitations for folks, but some caveats to consider that we have come across. The data is going to change from state to state. Some states collect race and ethnicity data. We do not. Registration dates, you'll want to figure out how this works in your own state. If you're doing an analysis, for example, how many first-time voters registered in the first election in which they were registered to vote in, what we've found in Texas, at least, is that if you lived in one county and then moved and registered in a new county, your effective date of registration is going to be your new county. So it's possible that you've been voting in another county before and you wouldn't know that if you just looked at the data. And then lastly, again, these are just sort of very kind of practical things about covering voting, is that in some states, the voter file it's a snapshot in time. It's people who are registered to vote at that point, which isn't really helpful if you are doing a historical analysis of how voting patterns may have changed. And so there are significant differences and things to look into in your own states between the voter roll file and then the voter history file. And that's it.
Hey, I'm Jessie O'Poyen. I'm with the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. And actually, this question's kind of for everyone because I'm curious about requesting the voter roll, requesting that file. In Wisconsin, it costs $12,500. So I was wondering if other people know what it costs in their states, if you guys have insights on what it costs here, and if you have any thoughts on good ways to get that information without spending that much money?
Yes. I don't remember the exact number. It's definitely more than $1,000 as well. The first time we requested this data, actually, we partnered with different newsrooms and did a collective request. The only problem with that is that there was some disagreement about when to request it. And the thing in Texas is, because we don't have online voter registration, people are being added to the rolls literally up until voting starts. And so there was a dispute when to request it, when it would be most useful. And then again, because of those differences between voter roll and voter history, you have to be requesting it pretty frequently for it to be useful for some types of analyses. So just something to consider, but we did partner with other news organizations. And I mean, it worked to get the ball rolling. Now we're in a place where we can kind of just request it on our own. But if you don't have those resources, you might want to look at other news partners in your area that might be willing to go in on that.
Lenny Sue Paul with WPTV. My question, can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by center your voters?
Yeah, I think I'll give you an example. Right now in Texas, we have had the first election under this new voting law. And one of the changes in that voting law were additional ID requirements for people voting by mail. And so we knew that there were probably going to be some issues this time around, just because it was an incredibly quick turnaround. The law because of the walkouts, didn't end up being signed until I think it was September. It wasn't enacted until December. There was this sort of ridiculous rush to update forms, and the application to vote by mail hadn't been updated by the time applications started coming in. I mean, it was kind of a hot mess. And to do that reporting, we were talking to a lot of election administrators at first. The first few stories that we did kind of centered on the numbers that we were getting from those election admins, from some of the voting rights advocates who had warned the state that this would happen. But we knew that we also had to focus on the actual voters who were being impacted by it. So it doesn't only have to be a profile on a voter, but it can be just an individual voice of an actual voter who felt this bill, who was affected by it and maybe almost didn't vote or didn't actually get to vote. So, I mean, it can be different ways, right? You can do a full profile, you can do a full, I think if in the lengths to which people often go to vote themselves can be stories, but I think it can also be as simple as connecting with people and including them in those stories. Obviously, you have to find them. We do sort of a combination. We end up hearing from a lot of people just because we do so much voting coverage, probably differently than kind of some of the local news outlets. The other thing is figuring out your network of sources, right? Whether it's election administrators, voting rights advocates, the people who are doing the voting hotlines that are hearing directly from people, what's sort of that network of folks that you can call up and say, hey, can you point me toward people who are running into problems that might be willing to talk to me? There are associations of retired people. That's like the Texas Alliance of Retired Americans. So think about all those sort of groups on the edges of voting that might be talking to people who are dealing with this, and you can sort of leverage those conversations to also find real people.
Hi, Anthony Gutierrez. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Texas. Excuse me, I'm obviously not a reporter. Here to kind of bring the perspective of, as a voting rights advocate, as a democracy advocate, what it is like for us, how we do this work, and I guess more importantly, like how we can be useful to y'all in just crafting stories or finding data or connecting with the voters so that you can center the voters more in your stories. And I apologize, I do not have a slide deck. I have 6-month-old babies who are super cute but very inconsiderate about my time. But I thought I was just going to tell you a little bit about like Common Cause, kind of what we do if you're not familiar, and then just talk a little bit about kind of how we work with reporters, like how we interact with reporters, whether it's like during the legislative session or during an election, and then I'm very curious about kind of questions and stuff y'all might want to hear about. So Common Cause, we are in 36 states. In states that we don't have staff in, we have usually like an advisory board, and we do democracy work. It's can look like a lot of different things. In some states, it's a lot of ethics work or like trying to figure out how to like change how courts select judges. A lot of independent redistricting work in places like California or like transparency work in Rhode Island. In Texas, it's 80-90% voting rights work. It's we try really hard to advance really good stuff, like changing how we elect judges or trying to get Texas to adopt an independent commission, but for redistricting. But realistically, based on who's in power in Texas, like all those things are very long-term, like 10-year plans for us. And what we're really doing is trying to stop really bad voter suppression stuff from passing. And when they do pass, in part or in whole, trying to figure out how we can help voters sort of navigate the obstacles that have been created. So what that looks like, I guess first during the legislative session, we're just doing a ton of, talking to legislators, crafting bills, helping draft good stuff. But most of it is doing the lobbying, organizing the rallies and the press conference and things to just like make a bunch of noise. During the election season, it's, Alexa mentioned there's many election protection hotlines. We work with a coalition that uses the 866-OUR-VOTE hotline. It's a national nonpartisan hotline that people call in if they have a problem voting or if they have a question about like, what ID do I need or where do I vote? Our role there is to recruit thousands of volunteers that we recruit and we train and then we deploy out to poll sites, and they stand there beyond the distance markers and just talk to voters as they go in and out, and you would be amazed at the problems that we uncover just having people there to talk to them and sort of feel those problems. The other big piece of that work is when we're not in the legislature, not in the election season, it's a lot of local work. And this is where the real opportunity is for groups like mine in places like Texas to actually advance good, like positive voting reforms. Sometimes it's working with commissioners' courts in places like Houston or Dallas, in Harris County or Dallas County. A lot of times it's just talking to like the local election administrators who have incredible amounts of power to administratively adopt like here's this best practice you can take from this other county to make your wait time indicator accurate. Which if you've ever seen like the wait time indicators that tell you like how long a wait is supposed to be at a poll site, they're usually wildly inaccurate in a lot of cases. So stuff like that. It's, I guess, pretty straightforward, but ends up getting kind of complex. I'm happy to talk about sort of any of that in more depth. But jumping over to how we work with reporters and how we can maybe be more of a resource to y'all. I think the first one, during the election protection season, when voting is open, I spent a lot of time just fielding calls, fielding texts from reporters, like just kind of what's going on? Or like I saw this thing about this thing online where there's a person in Harris County who's saying that only Democrats are allowed to vote at this poll, and he's a Republican and he's outraged and wants to know like, is that real? Is that like a thing? And it was a thing that just popped up in this past primary election, which was real. But there was a reason. There was a real like election code reason why like the Republican Party in that place like hadn't recruited a person for that particular side. And anyway, things like that. I think also connections, just, you know, Alexa was talking a lot about centering your voters. And this is another thing that we spend a lot of time doing is when we saw the vote by mail rejection rates, we got a lot of inquiries, mainly from like national media outlets who maybe weren't as familiar with, you know, on the ground stuff in Texas, but wanted to know like, can you connect me with an actual person that this happened to? And sometimes it's really hard to do. In this case, there was like, what, 23,000, I think, after everything was counted. So it was a little bit easier. But you know, there's sort of endless examples of those. I think that just in this past primary, there was also, we had a bunch of calls about a new Texas law where if you were transporting over, I think, 7 or 8 voters in a car, that driver had to fill out an assistance form. And a lot of people were curious, like, is this impacting like souls to the polls type programs? Is this impacting all the types of like, you know, senior centers, like all the types of places that usually transport people to the polls? Like, are they not doing it now? Are they doing it differently now? And that was another big one. One of the other ones that I think we do less of this, but the more we see kind of fewer reporters like y'all who are able to sort of who are statehouse reporters who have sort of the time to do kind of more deeper dive issues. I feel like we see more and more the people that are calling us are more like the general assignment reporters who don't really have as much time to get into the weeds of issues. So what we're able to do in sort of a lot of those instances is kind of help, like, if you want to take a deeper look into this thing. Like a recent example is with, there's a bunch of things in a recently passed big voter suppression omnibus bill that had to do with empowering poll watchers and making it harder for an election judge to kick a poll watcher out of a poll site if they were being problematic. So we were doing a really sort of in-depth study, going county by county in Texas, trying to get our hands on what are called certificates of appointment that the parties or campaigns use to appoint these poll watchers into poll sites. In Texas, it has been a huge issue for forever, probably, where right-wing groups will use partisan poll watchers, send them into minority communities to just disrupt voting. So, you know, we were trying to get all the data we could on where those types of groups were appointing their poll watchers and sort of see if we could analyze the patterns and figure out, like, what are they trying to do? Where are they targeting? And it's, you know, for organizations like ours that we have a million other things going on, it's tough to do all that. But whenever we would get press inquiries about specific poll watcher stuff, that was one of the things we were just kind of like, hey, there's this other thing we're looking into that maybe y'all want to look into as well. And there's a lot of sort of examples like that across all of our other issues that places where we might be able to help with. I guess legislative is the things that we can help with when the legislature is in session. This is kind of the longest list, I think. As a national organization, one of the big ones is if you're looking at a bill and wondering, like, why is Texas considering doing this thing that seems crazy? Like, do other states do this? How many other states? Like, what do other states do with this situation? Like, that's one of the instances where, like, a group like ours can be really handy because we all will have just like our Slack channel, just like all the executive directors in all the states, and just like, how do you all do, like, you know, voter registration? And every other state will say, we have online registration, and Texas will be like, yeah, we have this archaic, ridiculous method. We also and these obviously exist in like all of your states probably. There's coalitions of voting rights advocates. In Texas, we're the facilitators of what's called the Texas Election Reform Coalition. And having that coalition, it really makes it a bit easy for us to be able to help y'all when it comes to things like what organizations are doing things like rides to the polls, or who's doing the advocacy work on like this really obscure bill that nobody else really seems to be following. Just providing intel as well. Like this is something that y'all probably also can just call like legislators or staff, but a lot of the bills that we track are ones that often like may not be the ones that a legislator knows off the top of their head. So if they're just like, that ranked choice voting for like small municipalities bill that like, some legislator probably agreed to take that on because a group like ours, spent hours and hours trying to talk to them about, they may not know exactly what's going on with that, and we can sort of help like, yeah, here's where that is. Like if that bill gets a hearing, here's where we think that committee is going to shake out at. Here's where we think the speaker is if this thing makes it to the floor. Like intel on voting and democracy issues, another area where we can be extremely helpful, I think. And then one of the other ones that I think this is particularly true in Texas. In some other states, your Common Cause chapter might be someone who's like super policy wonky. In Texas, we sort of view our role as being more the people who can take the super wonky policy language of like this bill that like makes it permissible for this municipal utility district to do this thing within this population bracket that's like we can figure these things out given enough time, but like none of us do. None of us have that time. So we try to take the voting bills that are moving and high profile and the analysis that's generated by some of our partners who are usually lawyers and also pretty wonky, and just turn it into human language that makes it a little bit faster and easier for y'all to just like digest. And we usually create it not for reporters, it's for like our members and our 50,000 people that were like, here's this terrible thing that's happening. Here's the 5 things it does. I need you to call this state senator. But oftentimes, when we get questions about those, we're able to quickly just connect y'all and provide something that hopefully will help y'all just more quickly get sort of the confines or the what exactly is going on with the story. One of the other big ones. So we sort of are trying to do this more and more in our own work, just kind of like how we do coalition work and who we talk to and who we bring in, like to help testify on things. And it's trying to find more sort of intersectional allies. So, for us, that means like when we're talking about a voting bill or a gerrymandering plan that we think is unconstitutional, it's, how do we find the people that are going to be impacted by this on their issues, whether it's gun control or climate change or reproductive justice. And, it's democracy issues, obviously, like it's all connected, and connecting those dots isn't that hard. But it is a thing that I feel like sometimes it just takes someone kind of like laying it out to people. So it's a thing where, this is a thing that we're always thinking about and trying to figure out, like, well, in Texas, if we had a decade of these maps that were in court and by our accounts completely gerrymandered and illegal, like, well, what were the policy implications of that? Like, what were the things that happened in that decade that wouldn't have happened if we had a fair map at the beginning of the decade? And, it's a thing that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out and talking to allies and trying to figure out how to plug them into future work. And if that's sort of a thing where you're looking at a story and wondering, like, well, this bill, obviously this is how it's going to impact voting, but what's the impact beyond that? Like, how is that going to affect how public policy is created in the next legislative session if this political party is able to manipulate the outcome of the election to take a majority or whatever? So that is my short list of like things that we sort of, how we interact with reporters, how we can possibly be helpful, and very curious if y'all have any questions and what else we can sort of expand on.
I'm from Connecticut, a state with very restrictive voting laws, and there's no early voting, and absentee voting is very limited. So I was just wondering, if you had any suggestions. Like, one of the other problems is none of this can be done legislatively. It all has to be done with a constitutional amendment, which is a really high bar. So I'm just wondering, like, how, when you talked about how to like take the wonkiness out of it and make people care, they voted on this in 2014 for the early voting, and it went down big time because I think people just didn't understand the question. And perhaps we in the media didn't do a good job of like just explaining the stakes. I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions on how to help people understand something that is kind of complicated and wonky.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it's also, I would argue, Texas, hardest state to vote in the country. But this is an argument we have with our other chapters in other states. So I think the most important thing, whenever we are doing advocacy or lobbying, I find it almost, usually if I go testify on a bill, it's because we have to just go do some like rah-rah, like, or there's like, it's a bill that nobody cares about. If it's a really big deal, like, you're trying to get early voting and you don't have it, I feel like people don't really care about what people like me have to say. What they really want is the human story of who's impacted by this, who's prevented from voting, trying to find those people and get those people to, whether it's to go testify or, if you're a reporter, trying to find those people so you can sort of highlight those stories. Like, I mean, it's a good example, I think, in Texas, this is not recent, but like the voter ID battle, like most people just can't conceive of like who doesn't have a piece of ID. And it's not until you really get into the weeds of like, here's the type of identification you need, and like, here's the alternate forms, and like here are the types of people who, like, if you have these really, really just suppressive like laws that create an ID burden that's higher than all these other states, like here is a specific person that is going to impact. Or like, here's a person that's going to be impacted not because they don't have the identification, but because you wrote a law that's just really damn confusing, and people are going to be worried about like, well, I'm not sure I have one, so I'm just not going to go because it seems like kind of a hassle. Like, it's I think finding those human stories is, when you can get them to go tell their story in front of a legislator or like, in front of your audience, I think that is the single most important thing you can do.
Hi, I'm Samia. I'm at Cal Matters in California. I had two questions. One was you had mentioned that Common Cause can request data on poll watchers. Is that something that reporters can do too, and where, who would they request that from? The second question was, I know Common Cause was the driving force behind independent redistricting in California. What does that look like? What do those efforts look like in Texas?
Yeah, the poll watcher thing is, I do not know like statute in California or really in many other states. But in Texas, this is actually one of the bills we're working on for next legislative session. There's a certificate that a poll watcher is required to give to the election judge when they go in. Unfortunately, the next step after that, like whether the county is required to retain that and keep it in like, preserve it in a way that is responsive to an open records request, that part is like, it should be. We're discovering a lot of counties when we send them open records requests for those are saying like, we don't have any responsive requests, or like we just didn't keep those, or like, which is crazy, right? But the second part, the redistricting, independent redistricting in Texas is not going great. There've been a bunch of bills introduced. We helped write a couple of them based off of the California model, and they're, it's kind of a long game. A few of them got a hearing in the past legislative session, which was progress. But really the game plan for us in Texas is like trying to go to places like Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and pass local independent redistricting commissions so that eventually you sort of build that momentum to do something at the statewide level. And we'll see if it works, but that's the plan.
Megan with Denver 7 in Colorado, and Colorado has, kind of conversely to Danielle, as you know, some of the most accessible voting rights in the country. I'm wondering from your perspective as somebody that comes from Texas and as somebody that's talked quite a bit about restrictive access, is there blind spots that you've heard of in coverage in places where voting rights are more accessible that we need to be considering as we kind of move into the 2022 midterms?
Oh, that's a really good question. This is a question I haven't given much thought to because that's just not a problem we've run into in Texas, but it's, but Colorado is like, I mean, it's like sci-fi when I think about like how voting works there. I guess the only one I can think of off the top of my head is there are a lot of just new things, new like voting processes or technologies that people are starting to realize like, oh, that's not quite working the way we thought we were going to. Like, I think ranked choice voting is an example of, we talk about it in a way that's like, that is just going to be just transformative of our politics, and it's going to eliminate the partisan divides, and it kind of does. But there's also like when you saw it, I think it was in New York where they have been just recently deploying it. Like there were some issues, and like similarly with voting technology, I think Colorado was one of the first states pushing the type of machine that will have the voter verifiable paper receipt and like a whole like post-audit election process. I feel like y'all's probably works fine. I think there's places in Texas where they've just upgraded to new machines and are realizing like, oh, well, like in Harris County where you have a ballot that's like a gazillion pages long and it's a super long piece of paper, like that actually like screws up sometimes if you enter it into the machine. I don't know, there's like, I think there's finite details. Like if you look for like, what are the new things that are just adopted that haven't been adopted in other places, like there's going to be implementation things that are not quite right. So I don't know, that's my best guess of that one.
If the things that are being created to make voting more accessible actually are accessible to everyone, does everyone even know that they have these options? Are there communities that you can find where people hardly use absentee voting? And what are the things that keep them from using that? You know, I've heard from a lot of voters who even, I don't know if you all probably pay for postage, but there are people who don't do it because they literally can't go to a post office and buy a $20 stamp book. So I think there are nuances to voting laws, even when they are accessible, that sort of revolve more around who actually even knows about this, who is paying enough attention to know that this thing was changed, even if it was changed as an improvement. Does everybody actually know about that? Does everyone actually get to use that new option? So a different way to think about it.
Hey, Andy Chow with Ohio Public Radio Statehouse News Bureau. Catherine Terser with Common Cause Ohio says hi. Something that we're experiencing in Ohio seems a little unique is that we have 29 days of early voting. We have online registration voting. We have certain things that seem to be pretty good. Recently, in reaction to 2020, there was kind of an expansion of the possibility to vote, like curbside voting. And now in 2022, we're seeing a rollback of those things that were new in 2020, now trying to roll back in 2022. I guess, Anthony, I was wondering, what's your take on the other side of the people who want to create these restrictions are saying, well, before 2020, we didn't even have these things, so why is it that big of a deal? I'd like to get your take on that. And then, Alexa, what would your take be, you know, with this voter center thing? It is a restriction, but it's something that's very new to Ohio anyway, so it's just kind of like this weird dynamic of, is it a restriction if it only existed for 2 years, you know?
You go first.
Yeah, there was a lot in that one. No, so that's, I love Catherine, by the way. She's amazing. So, you know, I'm obviously going to be biased. As a voting rights advocate, I see these things as absolutely restrictions. In some cases, I do sort of get like where local election administrators are coming from. In the cases where like they decided to start doing new things or like move polling places to places that they hadn't used previously because they were bigger and would allow more like social distancing, and they were pandemic adaptations. And you know, if you want to not use that poll site anymore and you want to go to like smaller places, like, well, that's, you know, or fewer poll sites, I guess. Like maybe you can sort of see the argument there. What we see more often though is what happened in Texas with, like, we had drive-through voting, we had 24-hour voting in Harris County, and they worked great. It was fine. Like it was, you know, there weren't problems you saw in the 2 a.m. voting that you didn't see in like the 6 p.m. voting. But and nonpartisan organization, but like we very much like we're going to call out the people who are the bad guys in these cases. And in Texas, you know, Republicans saw that and were like, no, that's too many people voting. Like this is not like a standard practice. We want to see everyone in the world adopt. And there is no longer the possibility to do drive-through voting. Early voting has now been bracketed, so it can only be like within this hour and this hour. For us, these are very much restrictions. Like that's something we absolutely will call out whenever they're happening. So you know, it is sort of two buckets though. It is sort of like the one that is like if you want less early voting hours for no real reason whatsoever, other than you feel like it's going to impact your ability to keep your party in power, like that's obviously bad. But there are very real, like mostly cost considerations, I think, that a lot of counties are feeling because of, you know, we started doing this thing in the pandemic and then realized like, well, now that's really expensive, and do we still need to do that sort of thing? So it is a fine line, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know that much about Ohio. In Texas, I think most of it is on the side of like that's more of a political thing than like anything else.
My answer is kind of, there are two fronts to it. The first is that's part of the job that I struggle with the most. You know, the idea of if someone didn't get to vote, they're probably not going to reach out to a reporter and tell them, right? Or the types of voters that are more likely or more frequently disenfranchised are, I don't expect them to be voters who are going to be able to be, you know, reading the Texas Tribune every day and are going to find the reporter to tell their story about. And so the idea, and so when you have something like 24-hour voting, which Harris County and Houston did, the idea of who got to vote because that was available to them last time that didn't get to vote this time. And that's a pretty hard thing to figure out, right? I mean, even if I requested voter history for that county and tried to somehow find, if I could triangulate how many voters voted at that polling place, it's a pretty difficult thing to do. And it's almost like proving a negative. And I think that's the part that I struggle with. So you're not alone in that. The second part of my answer is that I think one of the things, when Republicans started trying to do away with 24-hour voting and drive-through voting, which was different than the curbside voting that's allowed for people with disabilities and people who can't go into polling places for whatever reason, is our approach to that was, trying to push them for answers as to why they no longer thought that was okay. And that became part of the coverage, right? It wasn't just that they were trying to take it away. I think with voting, it's easy to fall into, well, they're leaning on allegations of voter fraud that doesn't exist. But I think that it's easy to become lazy and sort of defer to that as the reasoning for wanting to make a change. I mean, and a lot of times it's what is cited as the reason. But I think, I remember having a conversation with a Republican in Harris County, and their answer was that they weren't convinced that it was worth the county's time in terms of the money that was spent on keeping a polling place open. And it was a vague answer. It was early on. They later had a more developed answer to it. But I would say that in your approach to covering it, I think that there's room to try to interrogate the actual reasoning for it. Even if it is something that didn't exist for a long time, that was just a new thing. What is the actual reasoning for moving away from it? And is there actually evidence to back that up?
Hi, I'm Carmen. I work at the Oklahoman. So Oklahoma's kind of similar, and I think this question's more for you, Alexa. So we have 77 counties, and we have a state election board, but essentially they don't really regulate the counties. The county election boards all operate separately. And so it's really, really hard to figure out, like trends between county to county. Like, for example, we had a horrible winter storm 2 years ago that left hundreds of thousands of people without power right before an election. And so in theory, you would think, okay, lots of polling places without power. And so if you called the state and asked, hey, do you know of any polling places that are having to be moved? They would just say, well, you need to call the county election boards. Well, I don't have time in my day-to-day to call 77 different county election boards. So I guess do you have any tips or tricks to help with that? I know that Texas has like 3 times more counties, so.
Yeah, I have been through this sort of mental exercise many times where I'm like, I can't call 254 counties. That's just impossible. I think my approach, and I'm not sure that this will be a useful answer to that specific example, but I think my general approach has been for something like these mail-in ballot rejections. Often what we'll decide to do is the 20 counties with the most registered voters. Obviously, those are going to be more urban counties. The dynamics of those counties is going to be different. And so what we then try to do is balance that out with sort of more anecdotal reporting in smaller counties that might not fit that. That's kind of our general approach when we're trying to get a more comprehensive view of something and really don't have the ability to call every single county. I'd be curious though, in Texas, a lot of there are sort of like emergency, it's sort of written into the code, it's kind of vague, but if you're gonna close a polling place last minute, or if you're gonna change a polling place from one place to another last minute, there are certain rules around that, and like counties have to have, I think, kind of emergency plans. I don't know how thought out or uniform those are actually out there, but I would think about like if you know that this is a problem and you can't always capture the breadth of it, can you capture the systemic issues around it? Can you find those emergency plans and find counties that didn't have anything in place? So instead of trying to move a location, they just shut one down altogether. And what are the implications of that? Again, I know it's not a direct answer to your question, but the other answer is just that you spend a lot of time trying to call 254 counties or as many of them as you can, or you try to find the folks who are maybe already talking to some of those counties. The last piece of advice I'll give you is that at least here in Texas, the counties have a listserv. There's an association of counties, and there are these sort of like listservs in which it's a bunch of election administrators talking to each other. So I would look into see if your state might have one of those, because there might be, if you end up sourcing up with someone who's on that listserv and might be able to leak some of that to you, or even not even for publication, but to tell you, hey, you should go talk to that county. They're having some real big issues. It might be a better way to sort of take your resources and be able to use your time in kind of a more effective way than kind of cold calling everyone. So some tips.
Hey, it's Jasper with the Houston Chronicle. This is a question for either of you guys. I'm curious what you just see as the most common like pitfalls or mistakes from reporters who are covering, legislative debates about voting restrictions or the effect of those laws, whether it's maybe specific topics that are commonly covered lacking context or overlooked parts of bills. Just, I know you kind of touched on that maybe a little bit, Alexa, just the hesitation to, fully use terms like restrictions. But, I just, maybe even Anthony, if there's just common frustrations you have with the way that coverage is done of these. I'm just broadly kind of curious if anything comes to mind.
I'm sure you have some. Come on.
I do. Yeah, I mean, for fear of none of y'all ever calling me again, but I guess there's sort of two like categories I guess I would think of. Obviously, like whenever something like a bill gets filed, a bill gets a hearing or something, there's like sort of the first round of stories that are like, here's what this thing is, this is why it's bad. I feel like sometimes we don't get, we on the advocacy side feel like we don't see enough of like the next step, sort of really deep dive coverage of like, the most recent example I can probably give you is like there's this big story in Texas with all these vote by mail ballots being rejected. Like there was a huge national story, but it did sort of taper off little by little. And like once you got to like the end story, which is like, this is how many ballots actually got rejected after certain people were able to cure them. And like this is sort of why they were rejected, and this was the Secretary of State's role in it. Like that, it was still being covered quite a bit. Probably like all of the Texas outlets represented here did it really, really well. But stuff like that, sort of doing the second and third sort of like why did that happen stories are the ones I think we don't see. And I think the second one, we've talked about it a bunch here already, but we sort of as advocates, so oftentimes we'll see the story about like, this is what this bill does, or this is like the thing that's happening that's keeping people from being able to vote, and not seeing the story that's like, here's this specific person that is impacted, and just not seeing like the human stories highlighted, or not seeing them highlighted as much as we wanted to. But, again, as the advocates on the side that are trying to like kill the bill or like stop the practice, we're obviously biased and wish that was just like nothing but coverage of just those things. But those are the first things that I think spring to mind for me.
Yeah, one of my biggest pet peeves, honestly, is coverage of voting rights that focuses on turnout, and we've now seen Republicans take this up here in Texas, the idea of, well, turnout was higher in that year versus the year when this didn't exist. They often use raw numbers, which in a state like Texas is a pretty nonsensical thing to do because of population change. But I think that so often the effect of voting changes or changes to maps even are thought about or measured by turnout or measured by, it's not that bad for Democrats if you're really talking about a redistricting map, for example. And I think that those are misguided ways to think about voting, just because the idea of turnout being a measure that if you just look at that overall number, you're not really accounting for the work that had to be done to overcome new barriers that were put into place, especially in a state like Texas where you do have a lot of people doing that work on the ground. So that's one of my big pet peeves. The other is not so much a contemporary example, but with the voter, it's almost like an overgeneralization of coverage. With when Texas was implementing the voter ID law, I think the natural question for a lot of people was like, well, why is this so bad, right? There weren't people, first of all, people just didn't understand that there could be people out there that didn't have IDs. But if you actually go back and look at the issue with the way that bill was enacted, one, there were questions about why it was even needed, right? And there were sort of lack of evidence, the fraud that was occurring in voting, the limited instances of fraud were not actually in person, people weren't impersonating other people. But separate from that, the issue with the big issue with that, the way that was rolled out, was that there weren't alternatives given to people if you didn't have an ID, right? That ultimately ended up being the change. They ended up including alternative ways that you could still vote if you didn't have ID. But if you go back and look at the coverage of when this was enacted, that sort of like nuance to it isn't included in a lot of the coverage, including the Tribunes. I wasn't there for it, but I went back and read it, and that I think can be frustrating as someone who is thinking about that. And if you are taking on this role within like a bigger political beat, those would be some things that I would consider.
Hi, I'm Kate Hompu from Spotlight, PA. I had a question about, so in Pennsylvania, there is actually, they just are in the process of trying to strike down this law, Act 77, that expanded voting rights. And it was a bipartisan effort, like in 2017, I want to say. And now since the 2020 election, it became very polarizing, and people thought that it was causing voter fraud. So I was wondering about your thoughts and your approaches to covering voter rights in an environment where the idea of more people voting isn't always a positive thing to both legislators and citizens themselves. Like the idea that expanding the electorate or legislation that would expand the electorate isn't always a positive thing, and how that sort of affects your coverage and your advocacy.
That's a hard one. Do you have immediate thoughts?
I would just wonder who doesn't think it's a positive thing? Because I think where I would start on that.
The reason that they tried to strike it down was because Pennsylvania went for Biden in 2020, right. And they were saying that there were accounts of fraud, and that in part the Act 77, the expansion of mail-in ballots, contributed to that, and sort of it's mostly on the side of the GOP that are now going through these voting rights laws that were bipartisan efforts, not 5 years ago, and the opinion has now changed because of the political climate. So when you're writing about these topics, I'm wondering, just how that affects advocacy, both with legislators but also citizens, because it's a large part of it is that there is a huge part of the citizen electorate that also believes in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that I think that there is this big conversation right now about democracy and whether it's in peril and all the norms that are being challenged. And I think the reality is that for a lot of people, democracy hasn't always been in reach in the same way, right? So I think that that's sort of one thing that I think about pretty prominently as these bigger conversations about a contraction of voting rights occurs is you have to kind of have your foundation. I think more specific to the issue that you're dealing with, it's almost, I guess sometimes it feels like it's almost like too simple of a thing to be able to, in every single story that you do about these efforts, you almost have to have your running B matter, this was a bipartisan effort, this was supported, this is how it helped, this is how it expanded voting access. And it seems like that's just a simple thing to do, but I think I would think about what are the things that you can kind of lean on in that way in your running coverage to really kind of hold on to reality in that way in your reporting. When we were doing redistricting coverage last fall, we ended up having sort of a guiding document of here are all the things that should be in your redistricting coverage, particularly as political reporters and not me were doing some of that reporting. And some of that was this important context about the state's history of discrimination. So I would think about, are there simple ways, even things that seem kind of simple that you can do in your reporting that way? And the more practical part of it would be finding the people who no longer will have access under this contraction, right? Are there people who were able to vote by mail in 2020 that no longer are able to? And is the justification that's being presented actually equal to the burden on that individual. I think you're probably in that land where you're going to have to try to humanize a lot of this as much as possible, while kind of hammering the fact that this was a bipartisan effort, and that up until the political climate shifted, people seemed to support that. I know that seems kind of simple, but it's almost, I don't know, sometimes the most simple things are we try to approach responses in kind of like big thematic ways, and sometimes it's the most simple things or the things you are already doing that can kind of help you get there. I hope that's helpful.
It feels like voting rights in general, just like all voting rights stories, like there is this overarching context now where, you know, Republicans were on board with the renewal of the Voting Rights Act, and that wasn't that long ago. But any of those types of things that you try to put forth today, like there is very clearly a party trying to restrict the access to voting and saying things like, well, more people voting is not necessarily good, which as an advocate, like that's just crazy talk. Like how could that not be good? Like I don't know. I realize that sort of as journalists, you're in a different position. You can't just be like me. You can just be like, that's crazy talk. That's absolutely insane. Of course, more people voting is always good. But it's you know, I think that broader context is important. That like it wasn't that long ago that there was bipartisan agreement that voting's okay. Voting is good. We should all be voting. Like it's kind of a radical change that we've somehow come to accept that like some people are making the other argument now.
One thing that I would add is also, I would recommend if you can find kind of the detachments between the policy and reality. One example, in one of the, I can't remember which version, there was one version of the big voting bill here in Texas last time. It basically created this like warning flag if there was like a formula for turnout in a county, and if the turnout was over like 95% of registered voters, or if it was like 100% of registered voters, it was somehow framing that as a bad thing. And I mean, one, it just didn't make sense because the denominator changed. It was voter eligible population. And so it didn't make sense because that number literally changes every day, right? As people die, as people turn 18. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense even in that way. But it was sort of also the concept of like, well, wouldn't it be a good thing if you had 99% voter turnout? And so I think part of the response here as well is that as an institution, you have to decide that voting, that higher turnout is a good thing, right? That civic participation is a good thing. And I think that, you know, I fear that there are news outlets or reporters that don't necessarily have the room to even be able to say that. And I think it's sort of important internal work that needs to happen to make sure that news outlets are approaching voting and democracy coverage in that way, because then it does reflect in the sort of reporting that you do. At least I think so.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Al.
It was really helpful, and I think gives us a lot of story ideas and ideas for how to approach it as well. So thank you both.